The man known to history as Adolf Eichmann was born as Otto Adolf Eichmann on the 19th of March 1906 in the town of Solingen in the region of North Rhine-Westphalia in northwestern Germany. His father was Adolf Karl Eichmann, the head of a Calvinist Protestant household and a bookkeeper. As such, the young Adolf was born into a middle-class, fairly typical German family in this region of the country at the height of the Second German Reich, the name given to Germany from its foundation in 1871, through to its demise at the end of the First World War. His mother was Maria Eichmann, but her maiden name was Schäferling. She would die in 1916 when Adolf was just 10 years of age, and as a consequence, much of his early life and teenage years was spent with Marie Zwartzel as his stepmother, when Adolf's father remarried shortly after the death of his first wife. Adolf's early years were marked by a fairly nomadic existence. In 1913, 7 years after his birth, Adolf's father had taken up a job in Austria, working for the Linz Tramway and Electrical Company, though the family did not move to join him until 1914, in part owing to the outbreak of the First World War across Europe that summer. And it was following this move that Adolf's biological mother died, and Marie Zwartzel became his stepmother. Marie was a devout Protestant, and Eichmann would henceforth spend his teenage years in a deeply religious household. While in Austria, Eichmann attended Kaiser Franz Joseph Secondary School, where, along with a traditional education, he also learned to play the violin and joined the school's Wandervogel group. These were similar to modern-day scout groups, in that they involved hiking and other activities in rural settings, but the Wandervogel movement, which had emerged in Germany and Austria in the late 19th century, were considerably more ideological, in that the Wandervogel movement was set up as a reaction to what was deemed to be the overt industrialization of Central Europe and the abandonment of traditional German values. This activity might have been instrumental in the development in Eichmann of a desire to create an idyllic and allegedly pure German culture in Central Europe many years later. The young Eichmann was growing up in a region and wider Central Europe which had experienced enormous tumult during the 1910s, which persisted into the 1920s. From the late 19th century onwards, the great European powers had been increasingly divided into two armed camps, one led by Britain, France, and Russia, and the other primarily composed of Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In 1914, these tensions erupted into outright war, although the First World War might also be said to have been driven by a wide range of other issues, such as rampant nationalism and economic imbalances throughout the continent. This first global conflagration lasted 4 years. Its most apocalyptic moments played out on the Western Front and its trenches in northern France, and when it finally ended in 1918, when Eichmann was on the cusp of his teenage years, Germany was the primary loser, and as Britain and France imposed a very harsh set of peace terms under the Treaty of Versailles, resentment within Germany grew in the early 1920s about what had happened. This resentment was even leading to the emergence of belligerent groups which were willing to contemplate armed insurrection in countries like Germany, none more so than the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party, which was led by Adolf Hitler, and which attempted a coup in Bavaria in 1923. This atmosphere of political tension was the one in which Eichmann would enter his early adult years. Having repeatedly proved himself to be a poor student, Eichmann had not only left Kaiser Franz Joseph Secondary School early, but also several further schools, which he then entered, including some vocational schools. He was in favor of leaving and gladly elected to join the burgeoning family business. In the mid-1920s, Adolf's father had gone into enterprise on his own and had set up the Untersberg Mining Company. The 1920s were a time of remarkable economic growth throughout Europe and North America, and the Eichmanns had entered business in the belief that they too could strike it rich. Now, Eichmann joined his father there in 1924, but the association with the family business would prove short-lived, and by 1925, young Adolf was working as a clerk at the offices of the Austrian radio company. He later moved on to work with the Vacuum Oil Company in Austria, a major American oil company which in 1931, while Eichmann was still working there, would merge with Standard Oil, at one time the largest petroleum producer in the world. Thus, throughout his early 20s, there is the facade of Eichmann being a fairly banal figure, a German émigré to Austria, working various office jobs at major companies. Nevertheless, while this is the figure that Eichmann's employment history reveals, his private life and his political affiliations throughout the late 1920s and early 1930s reveal something quite different. While working at the Vacuum Oil Company, the young Eichmann had joined the youth wing of the Front Kämpfervereinigung, or Front Fighters Union as it was known, a right-wing militia movement which had been established by Hermann Hilflo, a former Austrian army officer who, like the leaders of the Nazi movement in Germany such as Adolf Hitler, himself a native Austrian, had become extremely disaffected by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which had brought the First World War to an end. Moreover, Hilflo's movement was closely tied to Hitler's Nazi movement in Germany, in that they embraced both fascism and pan-Germanism, the idea that the German-speaking people of Central Europe and those that espoused German culture should join together politically. The party also espoused the idea of acquiring living room, or Lebensraum, as it was termed, in Eastern Europe for German people, by seizing it from the Slavic peoples of the region, and perhaps most significantly, the movement was highly opposed to the presence of Europe's Jews in Central Europe. This anti-Semitic stance would come to profoundly influence Eichmann's political views. In 1933, the political atmosphere throughout Central Europe changed considerably, in ways which had highly significant implications for the continent. Early that year, Adolf Hitler was elected Chancellor of Germany, and the Nazis rose to power in the country. Although they had been a negligible political grouping in Germany until the late 1920s, the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression which followed it had profoundly impacted on the German economy, paving the way for the ascent of extremist political parties, such as that of National Socialism. Eventually, Hitler and his followers were able to leverage the support of approximately 35% of German voters to acquire absolute power throughout Germany. They would quickly turn the country into a one-party dictatorship, and the offshoot of this, in Austria, was efforts by the Austrian government to crack down on movements within the country which were affiliated with the Nazis in Germany. In 1932, Eichmann had joined the Austrian branch of the Nazi Party, as well as the SS or Schutzstaffel, a paramilitary wing of the Nazi movement. But these would be banned in Austria just months later, following the ascent of Hitler and his party to power in the north, the Austrian government rightly fearing the implications of a foreign power having political branches in their country. The banning of the Nazi movement in Austria was significant for Eichmann's next moves. In the weeks that followed the prohibition of the Austrian Nazis, one of the leaders of the movement in the country, Andreas Bolek, crossed over the border into Germany and began establishing a kind of Austrian Nazi party in exile, with operations being run from Munich and Passau. Eichmann now took part in this exodus and was living in Passau by the autumn of 1933. Additionally, he was quickly in command of a small team of SS members operating from the Austrian border. Much of the work he was undertaking at this early stage involved the distribution of leaflets and other propaganda items. The goals of this were multiple. One was to rebuild the Nazi Party in Austria, but others involved fostering closer ties between Germany and Austria, with the ultimate goal of uniting the two countries and developing a similar political program in both, one which would create a powerful pan-German state spanning Central Europe and free of the vestiges of Bolshevism, socialism, and the Jewish people. And this is all very telling, as later in his life, Eichmann would claim he was not an ideological Nazi, but here, in 1933, he was willing to abandon his adopted homeland in Austria and take up the Nazi cause in Germany. Curiously, while he was stationed in southern Germany at this time, Eichmann was living near to Dachau concentration camp, which had been opened near Munich on the 22nd of March 1933. As soon as the Nazis attained power for the holding of political prisoners, he would become intimately familiar with the working of the concentration camps in the years that followed. However, he was quickly being moved to different stations. In 1934, he was moved to a branch of the SS called the SD, or Sicherheitsdienst, the security service of the SS, the first director of which was Reinhard Heydrich, a figure with whom Eichmann would become closely tied in the years that followed. Heydrich was a brutal individual, one whom Hitler would later claim had no heart. While originally at the SD, Eichmann was assigned to study certain aspects of movements, such as those of the Freemasons, the Masonic fraternity which had spread widely over Europe in the late 18th and 19th centuries. In this role, Eichmann was charged with developing exhaustive information on all Masonic lodges and members throughout the country, work which would highlight his bureaucratic efficiency at locating people and cataloging their movements, traits which would be central to his later activities during the war. Increasingly, though, in the mid-1930s, Eichmann was being assigned to positions working on the Nazi state's policies towards its Jewish communities. One of the central tenets of National Socialism was its rabid antipathy towards the Jewish people and anti-Semitism, which gave way to palpable hatred in the pages of Hitler's Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, a two-part diatribe which he published in the 1920s as part biography, part political manifesto. The tangible oppression of Germany's Jews began as soon as they attained power in 1933. Much of this was enshrined as the Nuremberg Laws of 1935. These essentially removed the citizenship of Germany's Jews and introduced wide-sweeping laws against everything from Jews having sexual relations with non-Jewish Germans to banning German Jews from hiring non-Jews of certain ages. The overall idea was to reduce German Jews to a lower social and economic status within Nazi Germany. It would all culminate on the 9th of November 1938, when a huge wave of attacks against Jewish people and Jewish businesses was carried out all over Germany. The Kristallnacht, or Night of the Broken Glass as it has become known, resulted in the deaths of several hundred people and the imposing of tens of millions of Reichsmarks of damage on Jewish businesses and properties. Eichmann was not central to Kristallnacht, but he was highly critical of the emotions of another branch of the Nazi state's Jewish policy. At this early date in the rule of Hitler and his followers, the Nazis were still reluctant to simply attack or murder Jews, and there was still a desire to adhere to international law in this respect. But from quite early on, it was realized that different methods could be used to remove German Jews from the country, particularly forced or voluntary migration. Some of this could involve pressurizing German Jews through economic measures to leave of their own volition, while others revolved around the long-standing idea of European Jews finding a new region in the Middle East to create their own state, where they could avoid the latent anti-Semitic sentiment which prevailed not just in Germany, but virtually everywhere across the continent to varying degrees. And in particular, ever since the late 19th century, many individuals had been viewing Palestine and the surrounding regions, the traditional biblical homeland of the Jewish people, as a place where a new state could be established for Europe's Jews. And now, the Nazi state considered whether they could encourage this movement through a mixture of coercion and incentives. Eichmann became central to these efforts. In 1937, he traveled to the Middle East, a region which had come under the control of Britain and France after the end of the First World War and the collapse of the Ottoman Turkish Empire, which had previously ruled there. Here he found a thriving Jewish community in British-mandated Palestine, and the Nazi state's efforts to encourage migration to the region increased in the months that followed. This was in keeping with the Havara Agreement, an agreement which had been made with certain Jewish groups and the Nazi state in 1933, which would allow for the fluid migration of German Jews to Palestine. As a result of this, and the more brutal developments within Germany, such as Kristallnacht and the Nuremberg Laws, some 250,000 of Germany's 437,000 Jews emigrated from the country between the Nazis' seizure of power in 1933 and mid-1939. Meanwhile, Eichmann had also started a family in the mid-1930s. On the 21st of March 1935, he married Veronika Ovela Liebel. 4 sons would follow in all, 3 while still in Europe: Klaus in 1936, Horst Adolf in 1940, and Dieter in 1942. In addition, in 1937, Eichmann abandoned the church despite the religious fervor which his stepmother had brought to their home back in Austria. In 1938, a further shift occurred for Eichmann. Germany had united with Austria in March 1938, the so-called Anschluss, or union of Austria and Germany into a greater German state, and following this, Eichmann was reposted to the country which had been his adopted home for so much of his youth. Here, he was charged with trying to encourage and facilitate the migration of Jews from Austria to elsewhere in Europe, Palestine, or anywhere else outside of Nazi-controlled territory, and bizarrely, much of his work involved the co-opting of local Jewish community groups and other organizations to facilitate this work. Then, in August 1938, the Central Agency for Jewish Emigration in Vienna was established as a subdepartment of the SD in order to oversee the voluntary or semi-forced emigration of Austrian Jews from the country. Eichmann was appointed to a senior position within the new agency. It would prove extremely effective in its task, and so efficient were Eichmann and his colleagues in this agency adjudged to be in the months that followed. But when similar policies were adopted in Western and Eastern Europe in later years, nearly identical offices were set up which utilized very similar methods as had been employed in Vienna from 1938 onwards. While all of this was occurring, Europe was drifting towards war, driven almost entirely by the Nazi regime within which Eichmann had become a key figure. The terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which had brought the First World War to an end, had dictated that Germany would be restricted to a small military force going forward. But no sooner than the Nazi regime had come to power in 1933, Hitler began rebuilding the German armed forces and air force, known as the Luftwaffe under Hermann Göring, following which a major breach of the terms of Versailles was seen with the remilitarization of the Rhineland. On the 7th of March 1936, the area of Western Germany, neighboring France and the Low Countries, which was supposed to remain demilitarized, worse was to follow. As we have seen, in March 1938, the Nazi state effectively annexed Austria into a greater Germany, while the following autumn, Hitler's regime began applying pressure on the European powers for the country to be allowed to annex the large part of Czechoslovakia known as the Sudetenland. Then by mid-1939, the appeasement of Germany by Britain and France had succeeded only in forming Czechoslovakia and Hungary into puppet regimes of Nazi Germany. Finally, when Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, the two Western powers declared war in response. On the 3rd of September, the Second World War had commenced. No sooner had the war extended eastwards into Poland and other occupied regions such as Czechoslovakia than the Nazi state's policy program towards the Jews of these areas extended commensurately eastwards. Indeed, the only difference was that owing to the concentration of Ashkenazic Jews in these areas, the scale of such oppressive policies would have to be increased in line with Hitler and the Nazis' policies, and Eichmann would prove central to these. After a brief posting in the Czech capital Prague, he was reassigned to Berlin, where he was now placed in command of the Reichszentrale für jüdische Auswanderung, meaning the Reich Central Office for Jewish Emigration. Here, Eichmann was subordinate to only one individual, Heinrich Müller, the head of the Gestapo, the most brutal branch of the German secret services, and there is no doubting that Eichmann was appointed to this position at this time because his intense anti-Semitic fervor was realized. His assignments in the weeks and months that followed emphasized this. For instance, he was placed in charge of specific activities which involved oversight of the deportation of tens of thousands of Jews from specific parts of newly conquered Eastern Europe into either concentration camps or Jewish ghettos, such as that which was established in Warsaw, the Polish capital, shortly after the conquest of the country. A sign of his increasing prominence within the Nazi state's response to the Jewish question was seen in December 1939, when Eichmann was appointed as Obersturmbannführer to head the Reich Security Head Office, Referat 4B4, a subdepartment of the SD, which was responsible for Jewish affairs, migration, and movement within the newly conquered territories in Eastern Europe. And here Eichmann was subordinate only to Reinhard Heydrich within the SD, indicating his ever-increasing seniority within the Nazi regime when it came to Jewish policy. Then, in the 2 years that followed, he was responsible for various anti-Semitic programs, including the so-called Germanization of Poland, the migration and ghettoization of Eastern Europe's Jews. Eichmann would later claim that he was appalled by some of the conditions he witnessed in Poland for the region's Jews. But this can be dismissed entirely. There is evidence that within weeks of his arrival into office in late 1939, he was planning the deportation and ghettoization of over 500,000 Jews in Poland. Indeed, Eichmann appears to have only been limited in his actions by competing attempts by other high-ranking Nazis to take credit for severe anti-Jewish policies in Eastern Europe. At this stage in the war, the Nazis primarily intended to resettle Europe's Jews elsewhere outside of the continent, certainly to somewhere which would not form part of the German Reich. It was not envisaged, though, at this early time in the war, that the Nazis would mass murder millions of the continent's Jewish people. There were numerous plans for resettlement, and Eichmann was soon central to these. One of these early plans for resettlement of Europe's Jews, which gained increasing currency in the early months of the war, was what is typically known as the Madagascar Plan. This envisaged the relocating of most of Europe's Jews to Madagascar, the large island in the Indian Ocean off the coast of East Africa. As ludicrous and perverse as the idea sounds to modern ears, this was not an entirely new scheme. When the Nazi High Command started giving it sustained consideration in 1940, it had first been proposed as far back as 1878, when the German Orientalist Paul de Lagarde first wrote about it, and it had resurfaced many times in the decades that followed, sometimes with the active involvement of Jewish groups who wanted to explore the feasibility of establishing the large island as a new homeland, where they could escape the rabid anti-Semitism and pogroms of Europe. As recently as 1937, the idea was under consideration by the Polish government in association with the French. When the Madagascar Plan came under discussion by the Nazis in 1940, Eichmann was central to considerations surrounding it. Indeed, he was in fact probably the single most important figure within the Third Reich in this respect. On the 15th of August 1940, he presented a memorandum to the Nazi High Command entitled Reichssicherheitshauptamt Madagascar Projekt, meaning the Reichssecurity Main Office Madagascar Project. The plan seemed feasible to Eichmann at this time. Western Europe had just been conquered, and with Germany and Italy making rapid advances in North Africa and the Middle East, it was believed that the Suez Canal would soon be captured, in turn opening the sea routes for German passage to the Indian Ocean and Madagascar. Accordingly, Eichmann called for the deportation of 1 million Jews from Europe every year for 4 years. Following this, some debate ensued as to how exactly the island would subsequently be governed. Eichmann believed that the island should effectively be a prison state, which would be run by the SS, though others like Franz Schwarzenmacher, a senior official in the Foreign Ministry, argued that the Jews should be self-governing, though the island should be cut off from contact with the wider outside world. These dystopian deliberations continued throughout the autumn and winter of 1940 and into 1941, and yet it is important to remember that whatever the debate on the details might have been, a consensus was largely reached by 1941 that the Madagascar Plan would be the method of solving the so-called Jewish question, and resort to it was only foiled by events within the wider war. Britain could not be made to surrender in 1941, and then progress in North Africa stalled, blocking the Nazis from acquiring access to the Suez Canal. Similarly, the Battle of the Atlantic also entered into a stalemate. This was significant, as it had been intended to use Britain's merchant navy to undertake the transport of Europe's Jews to the African island once the country was defeated. So, with these reverses, it increasingly became implausible that the Madagascar project could actually be implemented. This would prove fateful for the Jews of Europe. As Eichmann's Madagascar plan was effectively shelved, the highest officials within the Nazi state increasingly began considering more severe ways of addressing the Jewish question. Such debates were underway throughout 1941, as the Germans were making rapid advances into Soviet Russia and, in the process, conquering lands with hundreds of thousands of Jewish residents. It is generally understood that these deliberations peaked and reached a conclusion at a conference which was held in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee On the 20th of January 1942, the Wannsee Conference was organized by Reinhard Heydrich as the director of the SS's security apparatus. Authorization had been given to Heydrich to organize such an event the previous autumn, when the Nazis were looking like they might possibly win the war with a successful campaign against Soviet Russia. During that same movement, German army units had committed widespread atrocities against Eastern European Jews and other groups. Then, in a hubristic fashion, believing the war would end in victory, the administration called the conference at Wannsee in order to determine on a final solution to the Jewish question. Chillingly, there was an added political imperative to do so at the time, as the Nazis perceived it, the administration having determined that there were far too many people in Europe for the Nazis to feed. There were also plans in place at the time to simply starve 30 million of the Nazis' new subjects in Eastern Europe to death when the region was brought fully under Nazi control. This was the context in which the conference that would initiate the Holocaust of Europe's Jewish people emerged. Eichmann's role in the Wannsee Conference was very considerable. In the weeks leading up to the conference, he drafted a series of talking points and points for deliberation for Heydrich to use during the conference. These included details which can only have been prepared by somebody with a keen awareness of what would follow. For instance, the memorandum contained lists of the numbers of Jews in each European country, as well as details of how extensive the level of emigration and resettlement from each of these regions had been in recent years. Such a memo can only have had one purpose: to demonstrate exactly how long any policy of forced or voluntary emigration would take to remove the Jewish people from Europe. Moreover, while Heydrich chaired the Wannsee Conference and acted as its visible overseer, Eichmann essentially ran it from behind the scenes, organizing many different aspects, as well as overseeing the taking of minutes and preparing documents for it, and dealing with its aftermath. In so doing, he inadvertently provided a record of his own complicity in the development of the final solution at Wannsee in January 1942. Though there can be no doubt that Hitler and the upper echelons of the Nazi administration were ultimately responsible for the Holocaust, figures such as Heydrich and Eichmann were absolutely central to it in their own significant ways. Eichmann's central role in the final solution and the Holocaust of Europe's Jews which followed continued following the Wannsee Conference. The final solution called for the deportation of millions of Jews to several dozen concentration camps or death camps throughout Central and Eastern Europe, places whose names such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka and Sobibor have become bywords for the horrors of 20th century fascism. Moreover, the program of deportations was known as Operation Reinhardt after Heydrich, but his second-in-command during these proceedings was effectively Eichmann, who acted as the main liaison between the various offices of the SS, the SD, and the other departments which were involved in the deportations. Once they had arrived at these camps, the final solution essentially dictated that most of the Jewish arrivals would be executed in gas chambers, and this usually happened within hours of first reaching a camp. The image we have of people being detained for long periods of time at places such as Treblinka is a rarefied one, and it was only individuals who could be used to slave labor or who were useful in some other capacity who were able to survive long past their arrival at the Nazi death camps. Between 1942 and 1944, Eichmann was one of the principal figures in organizing the deportations to the camps. He was, for instance, charged with overseeing the recording of the numbers of Jews in each area to be deported, as well as seizing whatever remaining property they had, which was then confiscated by a Nazi administration which was increasingly starved of resources as the war dragged on interminably. It was this role as an organizer, a bureaucrat who did not control or develop policy, but who was mainly dealing with the implementation of it, which would later allow Eichmann to present himself as nothing more than a bureaucrat, one who was just as caught up in the machinery of the Nazi state as any other individual. For instance, during this period, one of the tasks he was charged with was organizing the train schedule for the trains which transported Europe's Jews from regions such as the Warsaw Ghetto to the death camps. On the surface of it, the organizing of a train schedule, if viewed in and of itself, is a rather banal activity, one which could be viewed as harmless if the individual doing it was unaware of where the trains were going. But there is no doubt that Eichmann knew precisely what the broader implications of his actions were for those who were being forced onto those same trains. A clearer example of his complicity in the Third Reich's crimes can be seen in 1944. Early that year, in response to secret overtures from the Hungarian government to the Allies to negotiate a peace, Hitler ordered an invasion of Hungary. In March 1944, the country was quickly placed under direct German administration, and Eichmann was dispatched immediately to the region. During its period of self-government, Hungary's Jews had remained largely unharmed by the Nazi state, but now, under full German occupation, the country's 750,000 Jews were in peril. In the 6 months that followed, Eichmann was personally responsible for overseeing the Holocaust in Hungary. Throughout the summer of 1944, he organized trains carrying as many as 3,000 Jews per day to Auschwitz to be executed, and by the time the deportations were curtailed in the late summer, over 400,000 Hungarian Jews had been killed. Even when orders were received to cease the deportations, Eichmann overruled this and continued for some time. Other crimes included a forced death march of tens of thousands of Jews from Budapest to Vienna in the early winter of 1944, a movement which Eichmann oversaw, and so there can be no doubting his absolutely central role to the Hungarian atrocities. There is other damning evidence of Eichmann's role in the Holocaust and his zealous participation in the same from the final weeks of the conflict. In the final months of the engagements, as the Russians advanced into Central Europe and the Anglophone Allies crossed the Rhineland, orders were received to cease the deportation of Hungary's Jews to the extermination camps. Many of the camp commanders and notable figures within the Reich, fully aware of the repercussions which would now lie ahead for what had been done, were attempting to reduce the accusations which could be made against them. Eichmann, though, ignored these orders, and in the areas under his command, the deportation of Jews to the camps continued in the final months of the war. And then, in the very last days of the war, when he was in Berlin, Eichmann is believed to have declared before a group of individuals that he considered the murder of 5 million of Europe's Jewish community to be a supposed accomplishment of the war, and one which he was actually proud to have played a part in. Given all of this, it is difficult to place any credence on his later arguments that he was simply an administrator, following out the orders of his senior commanders. The end result of the Holocaust, which Eichmann was central to orchestrating, was one of the bloodiest crimes ever committed. In the space of just over 3 years, between the taking of the decision to implement the final solution in early 1942 to the final weeks of the war in 1945, approximately 6 million of Europe's Jews were murdered, some of them in pogroms and massacres, but most by being deported to notorious death camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, where they were usually gassed to death within hours of arriving. Those who survived beyond this were generally used as slave labor, often until they were worked to death. As a result, in history, the Holocaust of Europe's Jews holds a singular position, while some events, such as the man-made famine which occurred from Chairman Mao's Great Leap Forward in China of the late 1950s and early 1960s, resulted in significantly more loss of life, perhaps as much as 60 million people in the case of the Great Leap Forward. Much of this mortality was not premeditated. The Holocaust is unique for the planned, clinical, and barbaric manner in which it was decided upon, organized, and executed. Adolf Eichmann was central to all three aspects: the planning, the organization, and the execution of it. However, the crimes of Eichmann, Heydrich, Hitler, Himmler, and those many others who were responsible for orchestrating the Holocaust would not remain hidden for long. Even as the final solution was being implemented in 1942, the course of the war in Europe and further afield was shifting. After a series of stunning victories throughout Europe between 1939 and 1941, the German war machine finally stalled in the snows of Russia in the winter of 1941, and that same winter, the United States entered the war directly on the Allies' side after an unprovoked attack on their Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Then, during the course of 1942, the North Africa campaign was effectively won by the Allies, and Italian and German forces were pushed out of Libya and Tunisia, opening the way for an Allied invasion of southern Italy, through the island of Sicily in the summer of 1943. A last do-or-die struggle on the Eastern Front was fought at the city of Stalingrad in the autumn and winter of 1942, but when the Russians were victorious here, they began inexorably pushing the Germans back westwards and were in Poland by late 1944. At the same time, the Western Allies opened a third front in Western Europe, in France, in the summer of 1944. From this point, the Third Reich's days were numbered. It was now only a matter of time before the full extent of the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime across Europe became known to the wider world, while the British, US, Canadians and other allies advanced towards the Rhineland and the Russians advanced into eastern Germany in the winter of 1944 to 1945. The thoughts of many officials and commanders of camps and officers involved in the Holocaust inevitably turned to trying to cover up and conceal what they had done. Consequently, in many instances, commanders began destroying records or even attempting to disguise what had happened at the death camps, particularly some of the small camps. Eichmann himself fled from Budapest to Berlin in late December 1944, shortly before the Soviets captured the Hungarian capital. When he arrived at the capital of the doomed Reich, he immediately began overseeing the destruction of massive amounts of documentation relating to the offices he had overseen in the past years, particularly those associated with the final solution, along with his role in it. However, in Eichmann's case, this was something of a futile endeavor. While some Nazi commanders might have been able to disguise their role in the Holocaust through such destruction of records, there could never have been a successful cover-up of Eichmann's role. The final days of the Third Reich came in the late spring of 1945 as the Russians encircled Berlin and the British and US came barreling through western and central Germany. Many of the German High Command would remain in Berlin, notably Hitler, who killed himself on the 30th of April in his Reich Chancellery bunker, and Joseph Goebbels, his appointed successor, who then also committed suicide the following day. With the Third Reich conquered and the leader of the Nazi regime dead, Germany surrendered a week later, and the 8th of May officially became known as Victory in Europe Day. By this time, Eichmann had already fled from Berlin and was living with his family in the relative safety of Vienna, the Allies generally having ignored Austria until after the war. However, he was subsequently captured in Vienna, but his real identity was covered up by his use of forged papers, which identified him as Otto Eichmann. Overall, this was a chaotic time for the Allies, as they attempted to sort through tens of thousands of individuals to identify who exactly was responsible for the Nazis going to war in the first place, and for the atrocities which had occurred in the death camps. Eichmann was eventually identified, but word of this reached him before action was taken, and he escaped from a labor detail in Germany in 1946, the beginning of a long life of subterfuge. His first years in hiding was spent in Germany, moving regularly between various parts of rural western and southern Germany under assumed names, and throughout this time he would have been acutely aware of the Allied war crimes tribunals which were being held at the city of Nuremberg to prosecute the highest-ranking surviving members of the Nazi regime, notably Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, Hans Frank, and Albert Speer. Central to these proceedings was an evaluation of the complicity of these individuals in the Holocaust, something which Speer, essentially an architect and engineer, was able to defend himself against. However, an individual such as Hans Frank, who had overseen the general government of Poland during the war and had been responsible not just for the Warsaw Ghetto, but also the subsequent deportations to the camps, could never exonerate himself. He, like many others, was found guilty and hanged in late 1946, and a similar fate awaited Eichmann if he was ever captured. Unsurprisingly then, we see him flee from Germany in the late 1940s, first to Italy, and then from there to Buenos Aires in Argentina, where he arrived in the summer of 1950 and began living under the assumed name of Ricardo Clement. He would escape detection for another 10 years. Yet Eichmann would not escape justice forever, and his capture eventually came at the hands of Mossad. Mossad, which literally means the Institute, from a wider Hebrew term for the Institute for Intelligence and Special Operations, had been formed on the 13th of December 1949, shortly after the declaration of the Israeli state, It was established as an umbrella organization to manage a variety of different security and intelligence departments within the nascent State of Israel, while today its operations have been expanded to cover a very wide range of activities. One of its central missions in its early years was to gather intelligence on members of the Nazi regime who had managed to escape justice in the mid-1940s, in the 1950s, and into the early 1960s. Much of this work focused on South America, and in particular Argentina, a country which had a large community of individuals of German descent, and where many members of the Nazi regime had eventually fled in the aftermath of the war. It was as part of this work that Eichmann would finally be hunted down, 15 years after the end of the war, based to a considerable extent on investigations undertaken by the famed Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal. The mission to capture Eichmann involved 5 Mossad agents led by Shimon ben Aharon. They entered Argentina undercover in early 1960, where they received information about Eichmann's whereabouts and the fact that he was living under the name of Ricardo Clement. They also had information concerning the whereabouts of Josef Mengele, a German SS doctor who had carried out horrific experiments at Auschwitz during the war, and who was living himself in Argentina in the late 1950s. The plan was to capture both Eichmann and Mengele and bring them to justice. Information about Eichmann's whereabouts had been passed to Mossad by Wiesenthal, who had located Eichmann's family home in Buenos Aires on Garibaldi Street in the city. It was near here that Mossad captured Eichmann on the 11th of May 1960, having observed the house and his actions for several days. As he approached his house, 3 of the Mossad agents bundled him into a car and took him to a safe house. Conversely, the mission to capture Mengele was less successful, as he had already received intelligence about his possible apprehension and had fled to Brazil. Despite several extradition requests, he would escape justice for the remainder of his life, right up to his death in 1979. Mossad were acting outside of their jurisdiction in Argentina and without permission from the Argentine government. Accordingly, they kept a low profile for several days after capturing Eichmann, during which time they confirmed his identity. Having done so, they proceeded to smuggle Eichmann out of the country by drugging him and taking him on board a commercial air flight, dressed as a flight attendant. They finally arrived in Israel on the 22nd of May, 11 days after Eichmann's initial capture. There, the Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, announced to the world that one of the most notorious surviving Nazi war criminals had finally been captured. Incredibly though, this was not met with the universal approval that one might have expected. The Argentine government, which for years had turned a blind eye to its country being used as a refuge for Nazi war criminals in hiding, objected to a violation of its sovereign territory because of Mossad having carried out an illegal operation there, while several Western countries, including the US and the UK, were concerned about what Eichmann might say in his trial about former members of the Nazi regime who had been repurposed after the war to work for the Western powers in the burgeoning Cold War with Soviet Russia. Eichmann's trial commenced on the 11th of April 1961 and would last for nearly 8 months, eventually terminating on the 15th of December 1961. He was interrogated daily, and surviving documentation from the time was cross-compared scrupulously with Eichmann's own statements in order to be able to determine when he was lying and when he was telling the truth. Then, during his interrogation, Eichmann adamantly proclaimed that he was not an anti-Semite. For instance, he claimed to have never read Hitler's rapidly anti-Semitic Mein Kampf or other key anti-Jewish texts, such as the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, while he stated that he disagreed with many of the anti-Semitic pieces which appeared in Nazi publications and periodicals such as Der Stürmer. Conversely, he claimed to have been a regular reader of Jewish works and to have an interest and appreciation for Jewish culture itself, noting that he had once been a subscriber to the Jewish periodical called the Encyclopedia Judaica, as well as having read Theodor Herzl's The Jewish State, a work promoting the creation of a Jewish state for European Jewry. Thus, one bizarre aspect of one of the architects of the entire final solution was to proclaim at his trial that he had actually been a supporter of Jewish culture in Europe. Eichmann sought to portray himself as simply an obedient bureaucrat who was following orders, which had been handed down to him by his superiors. He denied he was responsible for any of the mass killings and oversight of the deportations to the death camps. He further stated that he had orders and had to follow them in a totalitarian state where one did not live long if one failed to carry out those very same orders. Moreover, he noted that while he might have been aware of the killings which were occurring at the camps, his role concerned the transport of Europe's Jews in certain areas under his control to other areas. And he even claimed to have been personally uncomfortable at how the gas chambers worked when he was made aware of them, stating, "I was horrified. My nerves aren't strong enough. I can't listen to such things without their affecting me." Then, on one occasion when questioned on his presence at a mass killing at one camp, he admitted to having been at the camp in question, but testified that he had not looked in the chamber, that he had heard the screams, and that it so horrified him that he could not look at what was occurring. Thereafter, he claimed to have tried to avoid ever having to visit the camps themselves, while he admitted to his continuing role in organizing transport to the camps. Eichmann's baseless arguments and pleading of his innocence earned him short shrift. Against his own arguments, the prosecution was able to cite hundreds of documents which directly implicated Eichmann in the development of the final solution and the mass deportation of Europe's Jews to the extermination camps. Over 100 witnesses, many of whom had met or seen Eichmann during the war, were called to testify, and the written depositions of several Nazis who were in jail in Germany were also presented to attest to his central role in the development of the final solution and the organization and implementation of the Holocaust. But despite all of this, Eichmann continued to argue his innocence, stating that he had simply carried out orders to implement a policy which had been devised by others. He steadfastly refused to admit his guilt, and any expressions of remorse extended only to him, claiming he was troubled by what had happened, but did not believe he was ultimately responsible. His prosecutors were not convinced. On the 12th of December 1961, he was sentenced to death by hanging, the first and only time the death penalty has ever been applied in a case within the State of Israel. Eichmann did not accept the verdict without resistance. The case was appealed to the Israeli Supreme Court, the Beit HaMishpat HaElyon, and the 5 senior judges who made up the Supreme Court bench were presented with an argument which sought to avoid redebating the exact specifics of Eichmann's life and crimes, but rather attempted to argue that the German official's trial was invalid, as Israel had no jurisdiction to try him on the charges when and where it did. It is a telling indication of how limp Eichmann's defense of his past conduct was, that his team was forced to rely on such a legal technicality as their only means of being able to dispute the case. However, the Supreme Court was roundly unconvinced of the legal basis for this claim, and when the appeal was heard, in late March 1962, it was quickly dismissed. Then, last-ditch efforts by Eichmann to avoid his fate included an appeal to be extradited to West Germany, where he would most likely serve out a life sentence, or for a grant of clemency, which would commute the death sentence from the Israeli president Yitzhak Ben-Zvi. Yet none of these efforts succeeded, and it was reaffirmed in late May 1962 that Eichmann would be executed. Eichmann's wife, Vera, was allowed to fly to Israel to see him for the last time towards the end of April 1962. His execution was carried out on the 1st of June, just hours after he learned that the last appeals for clemency had been denied. Eichmann was hanged at Ramla prison in the small town of Ramla in central Israel, and only a small group of attendees was allowed to be there, including a group of officials and some journalists who could report on the same to an international media which had been gripped by Eichmann's case for 2 years. Eichmann had readopted his Christianity in later life, and his execution was also attended by a minister by the name of William Lovell Hull. According to his most substantial recent biographer, David Cesarini, Eichmann's final words were, "Long live Germany, long live Argentina, long live Austria. These are the 3 countries with which I have been most connected, and which I will not forget. I greet my wife, my family, and my friends. I am ready. We'll meet again soon, as is the fate of all men. I die believing in God." Then the Israeli state anxious to ensure that any grave of Eichmann's would not become a macabre shrine or point of interest, decided to have his body cremated shortly afterwards and discreetly scattered his ashes in the Mediterranean Sea. Eichmann's trial and death subsequently became the focus of much debate, in large part owing to the appearance in 1963, just over a year after the conclusion of the trial, of a book by the German-born political theorist and philosopher Hannah Arendt. Born to a Jewish family herself, and only having escaped to the United States in 1941, Arendt wrote about the trial for The New Yorker. This was subsequently published as Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. Arendt's work was highly controversial in large part because she criticized the manner in which the trial was conducted by the Israeli state as a show trial, but above all because of her depiction of Eichmann as a banal demonstration of how evil manifests itself. Arendt was struck by his ordinariness, a small, balding, and seemingly completely unimaginative bureaucrat. What Arendt wanted to convey most clearly was the idea that great evil can be carried out simply by a disinterested bureaucrat, seemingly without much thought at all. But this interpretation soon came in for criticism and created a stir in the years that followed. Most notably, the Lithuanian-born jurist and writer Jacob Robinson attempted a point-by-point refutation of Arendt's arguments, entitled, "And the Crooked Shall Be Made Straight, the Eichmann Trial, the Jewish Catastrophe, and Hannah Arendt's Narrative." In considering Nazi Germany, we cannot ignore Adolf Eichmann, although he is generally deemed to be a less ubiquitous figure within the regime in the historical record than individuals such as Adolf Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, or Hermann Göring. Yet Eichmann was one of the most central figures in the murder of the Jewish people by the Nazi regime. As one of the highest-ranking officials within the security services, his role in the gradual development of the Nazi regime's barbaric response to the so-called Jewish question was as significant as any other individual who was responsible for the Holocaust. As a highly organized bureaucrat who had proved himself capable of recording vast amounts of data about groups and people across Europe, Eichmann's skills in this respect were noted by the Nazi High Command, and he was involved in organizing plans to deport the Jews of Central and Western Europe into ghettos in Eastern Europe. This later gave way to an absolutely central role in the development of the so-called Madagascar Project, the Nazi scheme to deport millions of European Jews to the African island, where they would live in a kind of giant open-air prison. Eichmann wrote the core memo on this plan, and had clearly become central to managing the Jewish question by 1940. This soon gave way to even greater complicity in the Nazis' war crimes. He was central to the devising of the final solution and helped organize the Wannsee Conference, at which it was adopted as German policy in January 1942. Thereafter, he played a key organizational role in the transporting of millions of Europe's Jews to extermination and concentration camps throughout Central and Eastern Europe, where they were usually killed by gassing within hours of their arrival. There is no doubting Eichmann's central role in this, and he has been referred to by some historians as a managing director of the most bloody genocide ever to occur in human history, and the clearest sign of his centrality to the Holocaust occurred in Hungary in 1944, where in the space of just 6 months, between the early spring and early autumn of that year, he led the Nazis' program of extermination, which saw over half of the country's 750,000 Jews executed in the camps and through other instruments like forced death marches. Eichmann showed little or no remorse for any of these occurrences later on. What is quite unusual, given Eichmann's role in the Holocaust, is that he was not considered to be a key target when the Allies conquered Germany in 1945, and as the leaders of the Nazi regime were being hunted down. As a result, while he was originally captured in the immediate aftermath of the war, he was not identified properly or guarded well enough and managed to escape. Indeed, when one of the American lawyers received a document about Eichmann during the Nuremberg trials which followed, he made a note querying who Eichmann was, a peculiar ignorance about one of the most central figures in the atrocities which the regime had committed. However, this relative anonymity was certainly dispelled in the years that followed. After spending years on the run and in hiding in Europe and South America, Eichmann was eventually hunted down by the Israeli Secret Services 15 years after the war and was brought to trial in Jerusalem in 1961. His subsequent trial, conviction and execution generated widespread international media attention and resulted in Eichmann's trial and death being one of the most debated of any member of the Nazi regime. Thank you for watching until the end of the video. Responsible for the Holocaust. Don't forget to like and subscribe. At his trial, who should we explore next? Himself? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Administrator, one who simply carried out his orders and was not an actual formulator or director of Nazi state policy. This self-vindicatory account of himself was the basis of Hannah Arendt's famous description of Eichmann as typifying the banality of evil, the manner in which great crimes can be committed by an individual who believes themselves to simply be following orders. But while Arendt's description has influenced many interpretations of Eichmann, it is hard to accept it as an accurate one. Adolf Eichmann was involved in the evolution of the final solution at every stage and was one of the most significant figures therein. Whatever his arguments at his trial, Adolf Eichmann was undoubtedly one of the central architects of the Holocaust.